Long ago. Ramsay's boots were filled with icy water, and the howling winds drove sheets of stinging spray across his face as he struggled to keep his grip on the helm. This, he thought with satisfaction, is what being a pirate is all about. Ramsay leaned forward to bellow an order to his crew below. Each of the crew was an experienced sailor, and the last few days, sailing through what felt like literal hell, had taught them to anticipate each other's actions. Ramsay squinted through the darkness and the rain to make out Rathbone and Mercia moving in tandem. Behind them, Shan, as he staggered up to the prow. He held a battered bucket in his hands and began emptying its contents overboard, bailing away rainwater that had trickled down into the lower decks. Those three pirates, along with Ramsay, represented the entire complement of the Magpie's Wing, the tiny ship he'd commissioned especially for this voyage. His friends and rivals had scoffed at the idea of setting sail with such a tiny crew, least of all into the Devil's Shroud. But that was precisely why they'd failed, where Ramsay had succeeded. The Devil's Shroud. Every pirate grew to know its name, even if they preyed upon waters 100 miles or more from that cursed region. The Shroud ebbed and flowed across a vast region of the sea, writhing like a living thing. And before long, once able seamen would be coughing and spluttering, choking on the very air around them. They'd be so overcome that they wouldn't realize their ship was dying too. Ramsay had hardly been the first to dream of the uncharted waters encircled by those malevolent mists, imagining an oasis at the center like the eye of a storm that would contain, well, anything. Everyone had their own notions of what might lie beyond the veil, and the topic was a favorite talking point during fireside conversation, or whenever drink had been shared liberally. Fabulous riches usually featured heavily in people's imaginations, although long-lost civilizations hoarding said fabulous riches, and exotic beasts who could be captured and sold for fabulous riches. Still, Ramsay had always been sure that until the day mankind learned to fly like the birds, dreaming would be the only way anyone would peek beyond the shroud. Until one day, he crossed paths with Mercia. "You're blocking my light." Now well into his third decade, Ramsay had accumulated quite a bit of heft from the fine dining that success could offer. "And now you're spoiling my work. It's Captain Ramsay, isn't it? You've got quite the reputation around here."
"All of it deserved, I assure you. You're an exceptional pirate yourself, I hear. One with a lot of books and some curious ideas."
Curiosity is correct. And I don't just mean poking my nose into other people's treasure. We've all seen things out there that we couldn't explain. Well, some of us want answers, and we have ways of finding them out. Alchemy. Natural philosophy. It's a way of approaching what you don't understand, solving mysteries like, why does a compass point north? Who built the old temples you find sometimes, and why? What precisely is the Devil's Shroud? Some people say it's a form of magic, as if that were any explanation. But I have another idea.
Truth be told, things are getting a bit too familiar around here. The same old taverns, stories I can parrot word for word. Finding a way through the Shroud, now, that'd be an adventure to stick in the mind. Think you're man enough for the job?
He'd chosen these words deliberately. We'll need charts, calendars too. There's a shop in town that has some I've had my eye on. Smaller craft to use as scouts. Oh, and a ship, of course. She'll have to be swift and nimble, but tough.
I don't understand half of what you've told me tonight. But rest assured, I know what makes a fine ship. You'll be aboard her when we sail. Just you try leaving without me.
They'd had the Magpie's wing built in secret, a craft tiny enough to thread its way through those twisting roots where a ship might sail in safety. Together, Ramsay, Mercia, Shan, and Rathbone had stuffed the hold with floats and coracles to send out ahead, and stout wooden planks to patch up any damage they might take on their journey. They packed their provisions and made their final preparations until eventually there were no more reasons to delay. Finally, after days of inching their way through the stifling fog, starved of both food and sleep, they emerged into chaos. With no idea of where land might lie and no possibility of reversing course, they had no choice but to press on into the downpour. Feeling a tug at his shoulder, Ramsay whipped around to find Shan at his side. Even though the man was clearly bellowing, Ramsay had to bring their heads practically together to hear what he was trying to say.
Land!
Eyes widening, Ramsay gestured impatiently and followed Shan's outstretched finger. There was something there, all right. Rathbone, in particular, seemed dead on his feet, despite being the brawniest of the three.
Ramsay has seen those cliffs we're heading toward, hasn't he?
Shan pretended not to hear him and continued to wrestle gamely with the billowing cloth overhead. But Mercia snapped,
I'm sure Captain Ramsay knows exactly what he's doing,
before giving the sail a particularly vicious tug. While Mercia's relationship with Rathbone had been civil by and large, he was proving a hard man to really get to know. He was clearly a consummate pirate, despite possessing a clipped English accent, more suited to an officer of the Navy. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his shoulders were broad, and his head was shorn to reveal a scar or two. Out of all the crew, he was most fastidious about his appearance, and had come aboard laden with fine cotton shirts and gleaming shoes. Rathbone made a point of shaving every day, and took every opportunity to trim and tidy himself. Mercia wondered if Ramsay knew more about the man, and resolved to ask. The Magpie's wing had sailed through a crack in the cliff face, and was now drifting through a large cave filled with seawater. They dropped anchor at once, bringing the ship to a full stop, and took in their surroundings, as Ramsay moved to stand with them. The walls of the cavern were slick from the spray of the sea, and the dark sandy brown rock was peppered with smaller exits and pathways. The walls extended upward to form a series of high archways, a ceiling of sorts that provided protection. There were gaps overhead through which vegetation hung down. One by one they filled their flasks and drank deeply in mute appreciation, until Shan, ever cheerful, broke the silence. Funny how you only ever realize you're hungry when you've stopped being thirsty. Are we sure there's no food left? Never mind your stomach. Getting warm and dry is more important. Easy for you to say. It's not your stomach. Ramsay drained the last of his flask. We can burn the floats if they'll take. Let's start a fire. Then we'll see what we have to celebrate with, eh? We're wet, but we'll dry out. We're hungry, but we'll find food. Today, we four have made it through the Devil's Shroud. If that doesn't call for a belly full of grog, then nothing ever will again. This last remark earned a cheer, albeit an exhausted one. Shan disappeared wordlessly, though Ramsay knew the man well enough by now not to bother questioning his absence or his motives. Sure enough, his balding head poked back through a crevice in the rocks later, shining anew with fresh rainwater. I found a pathway that leads up to the higher reaches. Ramsay had had no clue who might fulfill such a role on his voyage into the Devil's Shroud, but Shan had come recommended by Rowena, one of Ramsay's few close friends, despite the fact that she'd always kept her feet firmly on dry land. As the owner and proprietor of one of the largest and most dependably disreputable taverns on the coast, Rowena was the de facto matriarch of the town, where she and Ramsay had grown up. When he told her of his plan to reach the Devil's Shroud, Rowena had promised to reserve his bar stool for him, so long as he promised to come back in one piece. Rowena had also pointed Shan out across the crowded bar, a lithe and balding figure. He was older than Ramsay, perhaps 50 or so, which was both unusual and impressive. Very few pirates lived long enough to think about retiring. What little hair he had left was already a snowy white. Dressed in a plain white tunic and simple knee-length breeches, carelessly barefooted, Shan might almost have been mistaken for a novice deckhand. Intrigued, Ramsay moved closer and wordlessly took a seat opposite, keen not to disturb the man in the middle of whatever creative whimsy had overtaken him. "Welcome aboard," he said wryly, before going on to introduce himself and explain the nature of the proposed voyage. Shan didn't agree to a fateful journey into the shroud right away. Rather, he listened intently as Mercia's findings, at least the ones Ramsay was willing to share in such a crowded venue, were laid out before him. He suggested a couple of modifications to the design of the magpie's wing, too, but finally clinked tankards and asked when they'd be leaving. Watching Shan now, as he tended to the roasting fowl, Ramsay felt a surge of gratitude toward Rowena for introducing them, and hoped that he'd have his chance to repay her. Mercia gave a luxurious stretch. Standing, she began to tug at the buckles of the great coat she'd been wearing since the start of the voyage. Her boots came next, but it was when she removed her tricorn cap and reached up for the pins that kept her long hair in place that she noticed Rathbone staring at her from across the fire. His face was a battleground, torn between the twin expressions of fury and shock. Problem? Finally, the others could see her as Ramsay had come to know her, a fair young woman with pale skin, now framed by waves of blonde hair, whose stern demeanor and slender figure had served her well when seeking a life at sea. "All this time, you're a—" Drying out. "I've no desire to end up with trenched feet or a peg leg, thanks to a pair of wet boots, and you'd be wise to do the same." "I thought women weren't allowed on pirate ships." "Quite a lot of men do. In the same way, quite a lot of women think male pirates are a bunch of superstitious, swaggering bores who don't pay nearly enough attention to what's past the end of their noses unless it tastes nice. But out here, it's a fresh start. Medicines, maybe, and monsters, too. The old legends have to come from somewhere, and it'll be waiting for anyone who's brave enough and bold enough to step up and take their share." Rathbone, he stood up swiftly and stomped away into the dim recesses of the cave. Only now did Ramsay approach the fire. Privately glad that Mercia had ended the conversation with her words and not her fists. "Think he'll be a problem?" "I've known Rathbone a long time, and he's cunning enough to know a good crewmate when he sees one. He just doesn't like being left out of the loop, that's all." "Did you mean what you said about monsters?" "Maybe. Why?" "That doesn't seem very natural philosophy of you, that's all." "I'd be just as bad as Rathbone if I didn't leave an open mind. If we do find a sea monster, the second thing I'm going to do is learn everything I can about it." "Second? What's the first?" "Slash at it with my sword until it stops trying to eat me." "So now that we finally made it through the shroud, what's next?" "We can't stay out here forever. Sooner or later we'll need supplies that can't be foraged, and a proper layover at an outpost. Ammunition, maybe, if this place really is as wild as we think. Until then, we see everything we can. Chart and note everything we can. Take everything we can. And bury what we can't. Then we return home to tell our tales and become legends. When you've all finished daydreaming, I think you're going to want to come and take a look outside." Intrigued, the crew rose as one and followed Shan up the winding path he'd discovered earlier. They moved in single file as they ascended, pushing through damp leaves and leaving footprints in wet soil as they wound their way higher and higher. Rathbone, lantern in hand, was standing atop the island's highest peak, outlined against a speckled night sky that was dominated by a low and yellow moon. New stars. Not one among them could spot familiar constellations or point towards Orion's belt. Even the North Star, brightest of all those distant lights, seemed to have different neighbors. Their compasses at least pointed the way as well as ever, but the implication was at once thrilling and disturbing. Wherever their journey had taken them, they could no longer rely on the constellations to guide the magpie's wing on its voyage. From now on, they'd be sailing under unknown skies.